dealing with the topic of domestic violence and the effect of COVID-19 on domestic violence. Before starting, I would like to quote one line which I always use, that is, if all men are born free, how is it that all women are born slaves? This is said by Mary Astle in her Some Reflections upon Marriage. Now, what is domestic violence? Domestic violence and abuse can happen to anyone, regardless of their size, gender, strength, yet the problem is often overlooked as 90% victims are women. Now, the right to live safe and have a violence-free environment is a fundamental right, but all people are not lucky enough to enjoy the same. Home is considered to be the safest place to dwell, but it is not always the same. There are situations where violence creeps into domestic houses at a level wherein the girls often face large violence. Women Violence against girls is become a global epidemic that kills, tortures, maims them physically, psychologically, sexually, and economically, and hence the need for a special statute was felt. Now, why was the need of Domestic Violence Act, that is the protection of women from domestic violence, is there? I would quote here. Section 498 of the Penal Code was already there, but that dealt with only with punishment for husband or his relatives for inflicting violence upon the woman. I request everyone to please mute themselves, please. A relative, a relative of a woman or husband would be punished or penalized for the cruelty that he would inflict upon her, but that would take ages and years because there are multiple factors for that. There was no immediate recourse available to the woman. For example, a woman who's been assaulted by her husband and has been removed from the house, she would get only penal action against the husband, but there would be no other recourse. Hence, the need for the special statute was felt, and that is when the Protection of Domestic Violence Act came into picture. Now, this act, the Protection of Domestic Violence Act, is known as the Act number 43 of 2005, and it was enacted on 13th September 2005, and it came into force from 26th October 2006. 2006. The act contains 5 chapters and it has 37 sections. The law in first time in the history provides for the definition of domestic violence, with the definition being broad, including not just physical or verbal abuse, but it also includes economical as well as emotional abuse. The Protection of Domestic Violence Act, henceforth I'll refer to the act, is in term for a civil act because it is meant for primarily protection and not for criminal prosecution. The Act inter alia provides various definitions, legal recourse to lodge complaints, and remedies available to women. The Act is aimed at providing immediate support to women who are facing domestic violence. Now, in order to understand what is domestic violence, it is essential to know 3 factors, that is domestic relationship, share household, and what is domestic violence. First, let us see what is domestic violence. Domestic violence is faced by every woman or woman who is sharing an household with a male respondent or any respondent to whom she is residing at a particular time. Now let us see what is a domestic relationship. Section 2F of the DV Act Section 2F of the DV Act defines the word domestic relationship. I'm reading out the section here. Domestic relationship means a relationship between 2 persons who live or have lived at any point of time, live together in a share household. Share household means one house, and who have stayed together in one house or are staying together at a particular time when they are related by consanguinity, marriage, or through a relationship in the nature of marriage, adoption, or family members living together as joint family. Thus, the main essential ingredient is there has to be a domestic relationship between the parties. Now, who can claim relief under this act? A woman who is facing violence in a domestic household, that is in a domestic relationship where she is sharing an household, can claim relief. consensuous relationship. It means the family members which are connected through blood relations such as mother, son, sister, brothers, father, daughters. Married relationships such as wife, daughter-in-law, sister-in-law, widows, etc. Other relationships include through adoption or relationships in the nature of marriage. Now, what is a share household? Again, I'm reading the section. Section 2S of the Act states that share household means a household where the person aggrieved lives or at any stage has lived in a domestic relationship either singly or along with the respondent, and includes such a household whether owned or tenanted either jointly by the aggrieved person and the respondent, or owned or tenanted by either of them, in respect of which either the aggrieved person or the respondent, or both jointly or singly, have any right, title, interest, equity, and includes such a household which may belong to the joint family of which the respondent is a member, irrespective of whether the respondent or the aggrieved person has any right, title, or interest in the share household. I'm pausing here for a moment. I request everyone to mute yourself, please. Participants, please mute yourselves.
Girls, please mute yourself. I can see Kajal Chavan, Geeta Shri. Please mute yourself. Unless and until you mute, we cannot hear her. Please mute.
I have muted. Participants, it's a request. Please mute yourselves. So we have seen here the definition of share household. Now let us see what is the definition of domestic violence. Domestic violence includes any injury or harm to life, health, safety, and well-being of the woman who's been aggrieved by committing physical, verbal, economic, or sexual abuse. It also includes injury to the aggrieved woman or her relative in order to coerce her or any other person to meet the dowry demand of the valuable property. The legal definition of domestic violence is defined in the Act and is mentioned in the chapter 2, that is section 3 of the Act. For the purpose of this Act, omission or commission or conduct of the omission or commission or conduct of the respondent shall constitute domestic violence in case it. Now I'm going to read these clauses. Please hear them carefully. Harms or injures or endangers the health, safety, limb, or well-being, whether mental or physical, of the aggrieved person, or tends to do so, and includes causing physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, and emotional abuse, and economic abuse, or harasses, harms, injures, or endangers the aggrieved person with a view to coerce her or any other person related to her to meet any unlawful demand or any dowry or any other property or valuable security. Or clause C, has the effect of threatening the aggrieved person or any person related to her by any conduct mentioned in clause A and B, or otherwise injures or harms, whether physical or mental, to the aggrieved, or cause physical or mental aggravation to the person. Now let us see explanation. What does physical abuse mean? Physical abuse means any act or conduct which is of such a nature as to cause bodily pain, harm, or danger to the life or limb or health, or physically impair the health or the development of the aggrieved person, and includes assault, criminal intimidation, and criminal force. Sexual abuse includes any conduct of a sexual nature that abuses, humiliates, degrades, or otherwise violates the dignity of a woman. Verbal and emotion abuse includes insults, ridiculation, humiliation, name calling, and insults or ridiculate speciality with regard to not having a child or a male child, with regards to color, with regards to body shape, or anything. Repeated threats to cause physical pain to any person is also a kind of domestic violence. Economic abuse includes deprivation of all economic or financial resources to which the aggrieved person is entitled by any law or custom payable under under an order of court otherwise, or which the aggrieved person requires out of necessity, including but not limited to the household necessities of the aggrieved person and her children, if any, for example, stridhan, property jointly or separately owned by the aggrieved person, payment of rent related to shared household and maintenance. Just to stop here, I would like to give you some examples. Physical violence would include hitting a woman or abusing her, assaulting her, causing her threat, continuously keeping her under fear. Then sexual harassment is sexually assaulting the woman, or even depriving of her sex is also a kind of sexual assault. Then economic abuse. Economic abuse is stopping the payment to the woman which she would be entitled if she would approach the court of law. That means that the maintenance which she is entitled, that is a husband, is duty bound to maintain his wife. Now, with regards to the maintenance of wife, many a times we see there are complaints that the maintenance granted to the wife is more. But understand, the court, while granting maintenance to the wife, only considers 4 points. That is, firstly, is the man capable of earning? Secondly, is the amount necessary for the woman for her livelihood? Secondly, the court divides the income of a man into 4 parts. The 4 parts is: first part, are not able to maintain himself; thirdly, for the future; and fourthly, for himself and the children and the wife. So the fourth part has now been changed, and that is only for the wife and the children, because the first part is for the husband. So 1/4 part of an income of the husband is the entitlement of a wife by way of maintenance. Example, if a husband is earning 20,000, out of that 5,000 he is entitled to pay to his wife as a monthly maintenance, because she is dependent on him. Now, after this, let us see whether can a minor apply for reliefs under the Act. Section 2B of the Domestic Violence Act defines the term child. Child means any person who is below the age of 18 years, and the same includes adopted or a foster child also, and such child can file a domestic violence proceedings. The child has to file this proceedings through guardian who is adult and is dependent on this the particular person. The father or whoever it is entitled to give maintenance to the minor child. Now, who can be the respondent? Section 2Q of the Act defines the term respondent. Respondent means any adult male with whom the aggrieved person could be anyone, is or has been in a domestic relationship. Respondents can be husbands or a male partner or his relatives. Now the term relatives, like the definition says, 2Q says the respondent is an adult male, but the definition says relatives could be female relatives as well. Now the next question that would arise in our mind is, can a mother-in-law claim relief against a daughter-in-law as per the Act? No. A mother-in-law cannot claim a relief against the daughter-in-law as per the section 2Q of the Act. But however, in the case, if the mother-in-law is facing violence in the hands of her son and daughter-in-law, then she can file application against her son and daughter-in-law, wherein the daughter-in-law would be an abettor. Understand, the relation of blood is very essential while filing an application under Domestic Violence Act. Now, what are the different authorities that a victim should approach when domestic violence has been inflicted upon her while she is staying in the shared household, or if she is not staying in the shared household? Section 8 and 9 of the Act define that a victim can approach a protection officer or a service officer under law, and she can approach the police officer directly. The protection officer is an outreach officer of a society, and it is essential applications before the magistrate, and he can help the woman getting support for, like example, medical aid, counseling, and making sure the order. Thus, there is also a service provide NGO as per the act. The service provide NGO works with voluntary association which are registered with the state government, and they provide assistance to women who are facing domestic violence. A victim can make complaint through the registered complaint service provider, and they are under obligation to provide medical as well as legal aid to the woman. What happens if the woman does not go to the protection officer and she directly approaches the magistrate? She can directly file complaint before the magistrate as an aggrieved party. If the woman is unable to file a application before the magistrate as an aggrieved party, then the protection officer on behalf of the aggrieved party can file an application, or any person who is there on behalf of the aggrieved person can approach the magistrate court. Now, stopping for a moment here and a little aside from the sections, I would like to say what happens when an application is filed before the court. When an application is filed before the court accepts the application and issues notice to the respondents returnable on a particular day. The respondents on receipt of the notice approach the court and submit their say. But before submitting the say or before appearing before the court, there is one more important thing which has been included by the recent judgments, that is a report of the PO, report of the protection officer. After the complaint is filed before the court and after issuing the notices, the magistrate would direct the complainant to appear before the protection officer, and the protection officer has to hear the entire story of the woman or the aggrieved person and submit the report before the court. For reason being, there was a wide increase in these false cases because the notices herein are issued mechanically. At the point of notice, the complainant is not heard, and hence the report of the protection officer is mandatory. The report of the protection officer is submitted before the court, the complainant, and the nearest police station in whose jurisdiction the complaint has been filed. After the respondents approach the court, and the proceedings begin, the complainant or the aggrieved party has an opportunity to apply for interim maintenance, and the court, after hearing both the parties, will either give interim maintenance or orders. We will be seeing orders in that is in the reliefs that are granted to the victim. The reliefs participants will mute yourself. The reliefs that are available to the victims are from section 18 to section 23. Let us see one of them, one and all each of them. Section 18 is a relief, that is the protection order. Through the protection order, the magistrate orders the respondent to prohibit on commission of domestic violence or aiding or abetting the commission of the acts of domestic violence. The court may also prohibit the respondent from entering the place of employment, or if the victim is a child, then the school, prohibit any kind of communication, ask him to alienate from the bank account which is together, or alienate himself from the share household, and by an order under section 18, the court will prohibit the respondents from committing domestic violence upon the victims. Now, section 19. Section 19 is a residence order. As per the section 19 of the Domestic Violence Act, upon an application from the victim, the court, that is the appropriate court, that is the magistrate court, shall, if appropriate, order a residence order from immediate effect in favor of the aggrieved party. The court could order the residence order in any form, either direct the respondent to give a part of the share household with a direction under section 18 to not enter the house, give the respondent the entire household, give the aggrieved party the entire household, ask the respondent to give a separate household along with the orders of section 18. Please note that an order under section 19 comes along with an order of section 18. It is mandatory of giving a prohibition order. Then section 20 would be monetary relief. If an application for interim maintenance is made during the proceedings, then the court, after hearing the parties, can direct the respondent to give the aggrieved party some amount in order to meet her expenses that the victim is facing. For example, her medical bills, her medical bills, her food, her clothing, her shelter, everything. Like for example, if any injuries are inflicted, then the court would order the respondent to pay the hospital bills. But the monetary relief that is claimed is primarily for the maintenance. Then after this is the custody order. As per section 21 of the act, the victim can ask for temporary custody of her children. Thus, to prevent domestic violence on the children, the court will order on, as per section 21, the interim custody of the children to the woman or the aggrieved person. Then section 22 is a compensation order. In this order, the court, after application of a judicial mind, and if seen that domestic violence is inflicted upon the woman, would order a just and fair compensation in support of the woman. The respondent is under an obligation to follow these orders. Section 23. Now, section 23 is a section which is there in the Domestic Violence Act, wherein it empowers the court to pass an ex parte order after the initiation of the proceeding, but before the pronouncement of the trial judgment. This is to ensure that the woman is protected through the ongoing trial. Now, what happens when an ex parte order is passed in the absence of a respondent? When an ex parte order is passed in the absence of a respondent, the said has to be challenged within 3 days of passing the order before the same magistrate, or there can be modification sought saying that it was an ex parte order, but the order has to be challenged within 3 days of passing of that order. Now, the section 24 mandates that all order copies or the judgments that are passed by a magistrate under the Domestic Violence Act are supposed to be given free of cost to the victims as well as the respondent. Please note, free of cost to the victims as well as the respondent. Section 25 states that Section 25 states about the alteration or duration of the ex parte orders. The duration of the ex parte orders firstly will operate till the respondent or the aggrieved party, whoever approaches in an appeal to the higher court or approaches for the discharge, but the same has to be challenged within 3 days of the receipt of the order. Now, section 26 is a unique section under the Domestic Violence Act that says that normally we see that a relief which is sought in one proceedings cannot be sought in another proceedings, but domestic violence states that any relief which is sought by the victim under the Domestic Violence Act can be sought as per the provisions of 26 in any other proceedings. For example, maintenance or any other thing, only the complainant has to inform the court that a similar relief has been granted by any other court. Now the question is, what is the jurisdiction? What is the jurisdiction where a complaint can be filed? Now, the jurisdiction where a complaint can be filed is firstly where the victim is residing, secondly where the respondent is residing, or thirdly the place where the act was committed. So a complaint of domestic violence can be filed in 3 places. For example, A and B are residing in Matunga, and violence is inflicted on B in Matunga, and B leaves from Matunga and goes to Pune. Now, if B goes to Pune, B can either file the complaint in Pune, she can either file in Matunga, or she has the option to approach the court and seek transfer from the proceedings, if any filed in Matunga to Pune, or if any filed in Pune to Matunga. The transfers apply here because it is seen that the woman should not have inconvenience, and she should not travel to and fro because she is a victim. Now, for second example, if A and B are married and they go and visit a place for a holiday or any occasion. For example, if they visit Ooty for a holiday, and in a holiday A inflicts severe misery on B, then B can file a domestic violence complaint in Ooty, because it clearly states that a complaint can be filed at the place where the actual violence was inflicted upon the victim. Later on, after filing the proceedings in Ooty and coming back here, she could seek for transfer to the place where she is normally resided. Now, Section 29. Section 29 of this Act reads with appeals. What are appeals? Orders under Domestic Violence Act are appealable. For example, an interim maintenance order which is passed or any order which is passed from section 18 to 23, these orders are appealable, but the appeal has to be filed within 30 days. That this is what I'm talking about, appeal, and not about altercation of an ex parte order. Altercation of an ex parte order is different under section 25 and appeal is different under section 29. Appeal is an order. Appeal is an application which is filed by an aggrieved party to a sessions. This has to be filed within 30 days and necessarily before the Sessions Court, because the Sessions Court is an appellate court in a Domestic Violence Act. Now, as per section 30, it is mandatory that the protection officers are government employees. Now, before turning to landmark judgments which have been passed in this case, in these acts, I would like to point out certain things. Is like, firstly, how a complaint under Domestic Violence Act has to be drafted. A complaint under section Domestic Violence Act has to be drafted as per the chronology. In the first paragraph, the woman should write, or the aggrieved party has to write, why is she approaching this particular court. In the second paragraph, in brief, she has to explain all the allegations. The second necessarily the second paragraph is not a paragraph. Sometimes it runs into pages. Also, it is mandatory that your domestic violence complaint, the second paragraph has one annexure, that is, here to mark and annex as Exhibit A is a copy of the complaint which I have served to the police station. It is mandatory to file a police complaint along with the domestic violence petition in the court. In your paragraph C, you will mention who all are the respondents. Thereafter, in paragraph number 4, you will mention what kind of reliefs you are claiming. If at all you are claiming final maintenance, along with that, your prayer should state that interim and ad interim relief in the form of maintenance should be granted from the receipt of this application. It is very urgent for victims of domestic violence to have orders as per section 18 to 23. Friends, please mute yourself. It is very mandatory to have reliefs to the aggrieved party. Now, the aggrieved party, in case if an aggrieved party is not able to approach the court and is in the hospital, then there is a provision which states that the protection officer shall visit the hospital, take signatures of the victim, and then approach the magistrate and file complaint on her behalf. And when the victim is discharged from the hospital, or if she is able to move out, then she can take over the complaint. Now let me show you all a few landmark judgments. The first judgment which I would say is Sandhya Wankade versus Manoj Kumar Bhimrao Wankade. In this issue has often remained controversial as section 2Q of the Domestic Violence Act defines respondent as any adult male who is or has been in a domestic relationship with the aggrieved person against whom the aggrieved person has sought any reliefs under the Act, provided that aggrieved wife or female living in a relationship in nature of marriage may also file a complaint against relative of the husband or a male partner. In view of this definition, the term respondent covering adult male person, the judiciary has time and again confronted with the argument that an aggrieved person can file complaint under the Domestic Violence Act against any adult male, not only against the female relative husband, that is the mother-in-law and the sister-in-law. The Honorable Supreme Court in the aforementioned case stated that to put rest the issue by holding that the proviso to section 2Q does not exclude female relatives of the husband or a male partner from the ambit of a complaint that can be made under the provision of the Domestic Violence Act. Therefore, complaints are not just maintainable against adult male person, but also under the female relative of such adult male. The case law is Sandhya Wankade versus Manoj Wankade. It is criminal appeal number 2271 of the year 2011. The next is Sabita Mark Burgess versus Mark Lennon Burgess. In this case, the Bombay High Court has had directed the respondent to remove himself from the share household. While giving this judgment, the court has the court has said that no matter that a man may alone own a particular house, he has no right to be violent against his wife, the woman he lives with, and from entering upon the residence, essentially to secure the life of the wife, children, and stop further violence against them. The object of enactment of Section 19 of domestic violence in Sabita Mukherjee Burgess case, the Bombay High Court has very succinctly explained the object behind the residence orders, and hence this has been the upholding judgment which say about the residence order. Further is the case of Minavati Sitaram Salvi, Minarati Sitaramanai Selvi versus Sitaramai Selvi. In this case, it is held that in the disguise of passing an order under Section 19(1)(b) of the Domestic Violence Act, such women members of the family cannot be directed to be removed from the house. Understand, I'm repeating, in the case of passing an order under Section 19(1)(b), where a court passes an order to alienate the respondent from the share household, cannot be a woman. The respondent against whom the order to alienate from the house is passed has to be only a male member. This decision has been upheld in Uma Narayanan versus Priya Krishna Prasad in the criminal petition number 9277 of the Supreme 9277 of 2008, wherein the court has time and again observed that to remove himself is only against the male relatives and not against the female relatives. Now, in V.D. Bhanot versus Savita Bhanot, the court has stated that even when a wife who had shared a household before the Domestic Violence Act came into force is entitled to protection under the Domestic Violence Act. This is a leading judgment because it clear-cut states that prior to the formation of the act, if any domestic violence was committed on a woman and she files it now, then that woman would be entitled for protection under the Domestic Violence Act. Hence, it entitles to aggrieved person to file an application at any time. In Mohammad Zakira versus Shabana and others, a very interesting question arose before the High Court of Karnataka, and the High Court of Karnataka in the year 2018 said that a petition for Domestic Violence Act by a husband can be maintained. The court heavily relied upon the case law of the Supreme Court in Hiralal P. Harsora versus Kusum Narsodan Sora, wherein the Supreme Court, while striking down the portion of Section 2A of the Act of defining aggrieved person on the ground that it is violative of Article 14 of the Constitution of India and the phrase adult male as appearing in Section 2K stood deleted. In the aforesaid ruling, the apex court had held that any person, whether a male or female, aggrieved and alleging violation of provision of the Act could invoke the provisions under the Act. In that view, the matter that the petitioner's complaint could not have been thrashed on the ground that the Act doesn't contemplate provision for men and it could only be in respect of women. However, the Karnataka High Court judgment, that is the judgment in Mohammad Zakir versus Shabana Azhar, the Justice Anand Bai Reddy, who had given the judgment, has later on withdrawn and stated that the interpretation was taken wrongly by him. Hence, now the position is an adult male cannot file a domestic violence petition. Now, Indira Sarma versus V.K. Sarma. Please note down it is Sarma, not Sharma. The Supreme Court has held that not all live-in relationships are relations in the nature of marriage, and has given the guidelines of the concept of live-in relationship. The guidelines herein are a live-in relation to be termed as a domestic violent relationship. Firstly, the duration of the relationship should be seen. Then, is there any shared household or pooling of resources and financial arrangements, domestic arrangements, sexual relationship, children, socialization in public, and intention and conduct of the parties. So these factors need to be considered if at all a couple living in live-in relationship and one of them is aggrieved and wishes to file a domestic violence case. The famous case in this matter would be of Ria Pillai versus Leander Pace. Ria Pillai and Leander Pace are staying in a relationship, and she has approached the honorable court seeking reliefs under the Domestic Violence Act. The court has held that it is seen that for a period of time the couple has been living in a relationship, and they also have a children, and hence Riya Pillai is entitled for relief under Domestic Violence Act. Second example I would like to give is the famous case of deceased Rajesh Khanna versus Anita Advani. Anita Advani, after the death of Rajesh Khanna, filed a domestic violence petition against the relatives of Rajesh Khanna, that is his wife, two daughters, and the son-in-law. The Bombay High Court, while quashing the proceedings against the daughter Rinki, stated that at any point Anita Advani or Rinki has not shared an household, and they are not in domestic violence, and hence the proceedings against her cannot be maintainable because Rinki has been settled in Calcutta and Anita is settled in Mumbai. Hence the concept of domestic relationship is very vast, and it should be known that the most essential ingredient is a shared household. Now the next case law is Lalita Tapo versus State of Jharkhand. In Lalita Tapo versus State of Jharkhand, the Supreme Court has categorically held that maintenance can be claimed under the provision of the Act, even if the claimant is not legally wedded wife, and therefore she is not entitled to claim the maintenance under Section 125 of the Criminal Procedure Code. Please note that the Supreme Court has categorically said that if a woman who is not married to a person is not entitled to claim maintenance under Section 125 of the Criminal Procedure Code, then she is entitled to claim maintenance as per the provisions of the Domestic Violence Act. Reason being, they have been in a domestic violence. They have been in a domestic relationship, and violence has been inflicted on her. Now, in Kamlesh Devi versus Jaipal and others, in SLP number 340 of 5/3/2019, the Supreme Court has clearly stated that allegations cannot be vague. The allegations have to be sufficient to bring home the guilt of the accused person or the respondents. Now, vague allegations means it should not be say that on so and so day the respondent abused me by the respondent abused him. The allegation should be that in the month of so and so, when I was sitting or when I was somewhere, the respondent abused me by using these kind of words. If it is assault, you have to define the assault. The allegations have to be specific. Time and again in all my lectures, I have informed people that please see to it your complaints are detailed. Your complaints need not be encyclopedia, but they should be sufficient enough for the third person or a third party to understand. Put the third party in your shoes so that he can understand what you have gone through. Time and again, I am repeating, please give your complaints descriptive. Do not make it encyclopedia, but make it descriptive. The next case law is Binati Das versus Uttam Kumar. The High Court has stated that the magistrate was wrong in denying maintenance to the wife merely because she has a earning capacity as a qualified person. Now here I'm saying I would like to rely on a Delhi High Court judgment which says that Delhi High Court in Kusum Sharma's judgment has clearly stated that when maintenance is to be awarded to a party, the court has to check in all four corners. Now it would not be possible for practically the court to verify in all four corners. So the Kusum Sharma judgment says that any party or both the parties who are before the court are supposed to and sworn affidavit before a court, right in saying his income and his true assets. Based upon that affidavit only, then the court can adjudicate the quantum of maintenance, because merely the common argument which the respondent states that the complainant or the aggrieved party is handsomely earning and hence she should not be entitled for maintenance. But that should not be seen as per the judgment of Binati Das versus Uttam Kumar, wherein the court has categorically stated that merely because a party is earning, maintenance cannot be denied to the person. The High Court has clearly stated that qualification of the wife and capacity to earn cannot be a ground to deny interim maintenance to a wife who is dependent and does not have any source of income. So this says that a wife may be qualified, she may be an MBA, she may be a doctor, or she may be a lawyer, she may be a teacher. Just because she is qualified academically does not mean she is not entitled to maintenance. The qualification should not be equated with the quantum of maintenance. That is, if a woman is qualified and she is not earning, then that should not be a ground to deny a maintenance. A woman by her own can choose to remain at home. That does not entitle to be disqualified for the maintenance. In Kuldeep Singh versus Rekha in 2010, the Madhya Pradesh High Court has held that if wife and husband live the share household to establish their own household, that is, if a wife and a husband leave their household, that is the common house of the house, to establish their own household, then the domestic relation with respect to the parents, that is the parents of the husband, and they cannot be liable as respondents. Now let us see what is COVID-19's effect on Domestic Violence Act. COVID-19 has come as a sudden shock to all of us, but the National Commission, that the National Commission Bureau or the National Crimes Bureau has stated that from 27 March to 2022, from 27 February to 22nd March, a total number of 396 offences related to women were reported, out of which 123 were domestic violence cases. The National Commission of Women on 17th April has stated that this has continued to surge, and they have received 587 distress calls or complaints between March 23rd and April 16, out of which 239 are domestic violence cases. Srimati Rekha Sharma, the chairman of National Commission for Women, in a webinar hosted, has stated that from March 21 to June 7, the cases have been increased from 239 to 1665. They have given numbers wherein women who are victims of domestic violence can contact them, and in order to see that the NALSA has documented cases, wherein the following are domestic violence cases reported. The Uttarakhand has reported 144, Haryana has reported 79, Delhi has reported 63, Kerala has reported 18, Andhra Pradesh has reported 1, and my head goes down in shame, which says Maharashtra is again leading here with the cases of 1002. These are only the reported cases. There are a lot of unreported cases. Many a time it is seen that domestic violence cases are not reported. For example, if a girl who is a victim of domestic violence, or a woman who is a victim of domestic violence approaches her parents and states that miseries have been inflicted upon me on the ground of anything, on the ground of demand of money, on the ground of demand of a male child. The demand of a male child is very common, and that is seen. Then the parents often discourage the woman, saying, or the girl saying, that do not file the complaint, try to adjust. The line where it comes, try to adjust, is where parents leave their daughters and their life is given at stake. Hence, it is an urge to all you people, if you know anyone who is a victim of domestic violence, try and talk to that person, and please ask them to step forward. The courts herein are giving you all one hand, or is giving one step. It is required for the victims to come 3 steps forward. I am now handing over this discussion to my colleague Swarali Zobrikar, who will, in addition to domestic remedies, which are the courts, and after that we will have a question and answer. Over to you, Swarali ma'am. Are you there?
Yes, ma'am, I'm here. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Swarali Zobrikar. Considering the topic at hand today, we felt it would be nice for us to share some of the provisions in other laws that benefit women. As we all know that the Constitution of our country provides a right to equality and right against discrimination based on gender. However, the same Constitution, via its Article 15(3), states that nothing in this article shall prevent the state from making any special provision for women and children. Thus, various acts have been enacted and provisions have been incorporated which mainly aim towards benefiting women, and this is precisely the reason why many of the times when these provisions or these acts were challenged, they were declared that they are not unconstitutional, because Constitution makes a specific provision for the same. Now, Swapna ma'am has already discussed in detail rights a woman has when she has been abused and she has faced domestic violence. So moving on from that issue, I will address you guys upon various other acts which are for benefit of the women. Right against dowry. is one such issue that is prevalent in India. The Dowry Prohibition Act 1961 is enacted to aid that issue. According to this act, taking or giving of dowry at the time of marriage to the groom or his family is to be penalized. It provides for the offense of giving or taking of dowry a punishment which may extend to 5 years imprisonment and with a fine which shall not be less than 15,000. Further, the act aims at cruelty inflicted upon a woman for dowry and states that even that cruelty is a criminal offense and not just accepting dowry. It has now become compulsory to investigate every unnatural death of a woman in the first 7 years of her marriage, both by the police and by the magistrate. This leads us on to this next section, that's section 304B of the Indian Penal Code, which deals with dowry. The section states that where the death of a woman is caused by any burns or bodily injury or occurs otherwise than under normal circumstances within 7 years of her marriage, and it is shown that soon before her death she was subjected to cruelty or harassment by her husband or any relative of her husband, or in connection with the demand of dowry, such death shall be called dowry death, and it is punishable, and it is a punishable offense under this section. Not only this, but when a dowry death has occurred and its investigation is carried on, there is a presumption laid down under section 113B of the Indian Evidence Act. This presumption says that when the question is whether a person has committed the dowry death of a woman and it is shown that soon before her death, such woman had been subjected by such person to cruelty or harassment in connection with any demand for dowry, the court shall presume that such person has caused the dowry death. This is very important section. Please make a note of it. Similarly, under section 113A, which is the preceding section of 113B of the Indian Evidence Act, it is stated this now relates to an offense committed under section 306, which is abatement of suicide. This section also says that if a woman commits suicide within 7 years of her marriage, and if there is evidence of ill treatment by the husband or other members of his family, then the burden of proving shifts from the prosecution onto the accused or such other members who are framed as accused to prove that there was no abatement. Now, we all know that under criminal law, when something has been alleged against someone, that if suppose it is said that a person has committed the crime, then the person making the allegation or the prosecution has to substantiate the allegation. The burden of proof is on them. But this section makes a different provision saying that when it relates to abatement of suicide related to a woman within 7 years of her marriage, then the burden of proof shifts from the prosecution to the accused persons and they have to show that there was no abatement. Moving on from dowry related rights to rights against sexual harassment. Now, the sexual harassment of women at workplace was an act that was incorporated in 2013. This act seeks to protect women from sexual harassment at their place of work. Sexual harassment of the place of work includes the use of language with sexual overtones, invasion of private space of a woman by the male colleague, hovering, subtle touches, etc. Further, section 376 of IPC also makes a specific provision for sexual intercourse by a person in authority, which also gets covered under sexual harassment at workplace. But now we all know that there is a recent case of Vishaka, wherein Supreme Court has laid down certain norms, and now it is necessary for each and every workplace to have an internal complaints committee which has to be established and which deals with harassment of women at workplace. Then we come to section 354 of IPC, which also deals with eve teasing and sexual harassment, not just related to the workplace. Section 354 relates to assault or criminal force to a woman with the intent to outrage her modesty. Further, sections 354 A, B, C, and D deal with sexual harassment, assault with the intent to disrobe a woman, voyeurism, and stalking, etc. Also, 509 of IPC states that any individual who utters a word or offensive comment or makes any such gesture or intrudes the privacy of a woman, he has committed an offense under section 509. Apart from dowry deaths or apart from sexual harassments, there are large cases in our country which relate to female feticide. For IPC had already made a provision, that is section 313 to 316, which states that female feticide or forcing the wife to terminate her pregnancy are forms of domestic violence and are recognized as offences. However, this was not enough to curb this offence. Therefore, the PCPNDT Act 1994 came to be established. This is an act to provide for the prohibition of sex selection before or after conception and for regulation of prenatal diagnostic techniques for the purpose of detecting genetic abnormalities or metabolic disorders or chromosomal abnormalities or certain congenital malformations or sex-linked disorders and for the prevention of their misuse for sex determination leading to female feticide. So the basic object is that whatever technology is available these days, it should not be misused for the determination of sex determination and ultimately should not lead to female feticides and any other matters that are incidental therewith. A very old custom that was in our society, which is thankfully not practiced nowadays, was the custom of sati. To prohibit that, also the Commission of Sati Prevention Act 1987 was formulated. This act was obviously to criminalize the observance and support and justification and propagation of sati. Thankfully, we don't find any sati cases these days. However, if in certain extreme rural parts of our country it is prevalent, this is the act which prohibits, makes it offense. We come on to rights against illegal abortion. The Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act 1971 aims at reducing the occurrence of illegal abortion and consequent maternal mortality and morbidity. It clearly states the conditions under which a pregnancy can be ended or aborted and specifies the persons qualified to conduct the same. Now let's come to the very important offense that is committed against women these days, that is the offense of rape. So let's look at the offense of rape, what section stated, and the rights of a woman in case of rape. Offense of rape cannot just be found in one single section, or it cannot be looked into only in IPC or only in certain places. We have to look at the CRPC, the IPC, and various Supreme Court rulings together. Section 375 and 376 of IPC provide for the offense and the punishment of rape. When it comes to recording the statement of a woman who has been upon whom rape has been committed, it is stated that a woman who has been raped has a right to record a statement in private in front of the magistrate and without being overheard by anyone else. She also has freedom to record her statement with a lady constable or a police officer in person. Under section, the cops will, that is, the police officers will have to give privacy to the victim without stressing her in front of masses. Further, when it comes to registering of the offense of rape, a registration of untimely registration is also allowed, because there are many reasons as to why a woman would postpone going to the police or postpone lodging a complaint. She considers the reputation, the dignity of her family, what society would think of her, if any threats would have been received from the culprit, etc. So the police officers can in no way decline to register her complaint, no matter how late the complainant has come forward, because various Supreme Court rulings have also stated that delay does not matter when it comes to rape cases. The self-respect of a woman comes before anything else, and she cannot be denied of this right to file a complaint. So, a rape victim can register a police complaint from any police station under the system of filing a zero FIR. Supreme Court, by its ruling, has stated that sometimes a police station under which the incident occurs refuses to register the victim's complaints in order to keep clear of the responsibility and tries sending the victim to another police station. In such cases, she has the right to lodge an FIR at any police station in the city under the zero FIR rule. The senior officer will then direct the station holder officer of the concerned police station to lodge the FIR, and the FIR can then be shifted to the concerned police station which has the appropriate jurisdiction. Now, under sections 160 onwards of CRPC, a woman also has the right to not to be constantly called to the police station for interrogation. This law provides that Indian women have the right of not being physically present at the police station, and the police can interrogate a woman at her residence in the presence of a woman constable, and if she wants, in presence of family members as well. Further, when it comes to victims of rape, it is very important that their confidentiality is maintained. Now, the section 228A of IPC states that under no circumstances can the identity of a rape victim be revealed. Neither the police nor media can make known the name of the victim in public. Section 228 of the Indian Penal Code makes the disclosure of a victim's identity a punishable offense. Even printing or publishing a name or any matter which may make known the identity of a woman against whom an offense has been committed is punishable. This is mainly done to prevent social victimization or to make sure that no judgmental attitude has been shown towards a woman. Even while a judgment of the offense is in progress at any court, the name of the victim is not indicated and she is only described as the victim even in the judgment. Now, all of these rights that are given to the woman when she is a victim of a crime. Now, suppose a woman is alleged to have committed a crime and she is the offender, then also she has certain rights. The rights at the time of arrest come into picture over here. Section 46(4) of the CRPC state that, save in exceptional circumstances, no woman can be arrested after sunset and before sunrise, and where such exceptional circumstances exist, the woman police officer shall, by making a written report, obtain prior permission of the judicial magistrate of the first class within whose local jurisdiction the offence is committed or the arrest is to be made. Further, other rights which are usually given to any accused person under the CRPC are also applicable to women offenders. Now let's come to a completely different criteria of rights that a woman has, which is right to maintenance. Swapna already told us that she has a right to maintenance under section 125 of CRPC. A brief introduction of the section is that if any person having sufficient means neglects or refuses to maintain his wife and children who are unable to maintain themselves, the magistrate of the first class may, upon proof of such neglect or refusal, order such person to make a monthly allowance for the maintenance of his wife and children at such monthly rate not exceeding 500 rupees per head, or as such the magistrate thinks fit. This section now is not only for the benefit of women, but it also benefits the parents of a person, the wife of a person, the children of a person. But in this connection, I am mentioning and stressing only upon the benefit that it has to a wife. Other than section 125 of CRPC, the Hindu Marriage Act 1955, I'm very sorry, also provides for maintenance. There are two sections in this act which talk about the same. Section 24 states that maintenance talks about maintenance pendentillite and expenses of proceeding, which means that proceedings under Hindu Marriage Act are going on in the court of law. A husband needs to provide for maintenance pendentillite, that is during the pendency of those proceedings. And section 25 of the act states that permanent alimony and maintenance, that is after the divorce proceedings or after the proceedings have been concluded, the alimony or the maintenance that has to be paid by the husband to the wife. Let's go on to rights related to the employment. The Equal Remuneration Act 1976 deals with this right. Section 4 of the said Act covers the duty of employer to pay equal remuneration to men and women workers for same work of same nature. And Section 5 states that there is no discrimination is to be made while recruiting men and women workers. For relation to employment and its rights, the Maternity Benefit Act 1861 also comes into picture. This act regulates the employment of women and maternity benefits mandated by law. Section 4 of Maternity Benefit Act states that employment or work by women prohibited during certain period and makes rules and regulations regarding to the same. And further, in Section 5 states the right to payment of maternity benefit. Now, this Maternity Benefit Act came to be amended in 2017. Now, this amended act has brought about certain groundbreaking laws which concern working women. This includes the increase of paid maternity leave from 12 weeks to 26 weeks, which is given in Section 5, subsection 3, and 5, subsection 5 also puts in an option of work from home after the delivery and after the maternity leave has been concluded.